Thank you for joining me today. My name is Kalvin Kaur. I'm a solicitor. I've been working with children for 15 years or so, and out of those 15 years I've been working specifically with children who have been trafficked. I'm a protection solicitor, which means I work in the field of immigration, asylum and human rights. Now, when I started out in my career, I quickly realised that actually I wasn't getting the instructions I needed from my very young client. This then led me on to explore and read what kind of methods I could employ to take instructions whilst always keeping best interests in mind. I came to realise that unfortunately there wasn't much literature out there. What follows next is what I've created over the years. It is a tried and tested method. It, I believe, does work. Of course, there's always scope for development, and it is a work in progress. It is something which I believe is a foundation that most people can use when working with children who have been trafficked. But however, of course, you'll need to adapt it to your own circumstances. To my mind, the first thing that needs to be taken into account is just some considerations before we've even met the child. So it's what I called pre-interview considerations. Now, chief amongst those is the language that we employ. This necessarily means a shift in our natural instinct of employing language which may be understood by adults to that which should be readily understood by the child in front of you. It also means remembering that the child is the person we're concerned with, irrespective of how many adults may be in the room. Frequently, young children will be accompanied by responsible adults. That may be the foster parent, that may be an advocate worker, that may be a social worker. Now, whilst that's necessary, what this shouldn't do is detract from our main concern, which is the child. There's a UNHCR document, which is a really great document, and it talks about the physical preparation of the room. It talks about where a table should be placed, where the seating should be placed, and where the child should be placed. One of the main things that it talks about is to be aware of not placing a child where there may be blinding light. What blinding light means is simply when a child is placed at a table, perhaps, talking to the advisor or the support worker, but the child is actually facing a window. Now, what can happen at times, especially when the weather is sunny, is that the sun can come through the window and create a blinding light. This will cause the child disruption, and it may lead to the child being uncomfortable or the child having a headache because of the blinding light. So just be a little aware of where the child is placed in relation to any windows or any sources of light, as well as being aware of where the blinding light source may be. UNHCR also suggests that all the seating should be on one level. Therefore, this is to avoid any perception of authority. So sometimes if I'm able to, and if my room or my employer allows, I dispose of any tables and I just simply use comfortable seating in a circle without a table. Now, it's amazing how much this can impact disclosure. Once we walk away or we move away from a formal setup to a much more relaxed setup with the child, this can without doubt aid disclosure. Another thing to be aware of is, insofar as possible, try to minimize any distracting noise. So simple things such as placing the phone on do not disturb, making sure people are aware that you are in an appointment, so not to just simply walk in or knock and walk in, again can go some way in creating a safe environment for the child to disclose. Be also aware of your own appearance. Now, trafficked children by and large have been trafficked by someone in authority or an adult in authority. In my own role as a solicitor, I rarely wear a jacket or any formal clothing. That's and so I do not appear to be yet another adult in authority when I'm speaking to a child who's been trafficked. So just take a moment's thought to think of what your appearance says to a child who has been trafficked. Of course, try and keep refreshments at hand. In my experience, most children do not drink tea or coffee, but in the winter, hot chocolate is always a winner. Not only is it hot, but it's also chocolate. So try to keep hot chocolate and dilute such as orange squash handy. Some children that we speak to and represent may not speak English. Now, in order for their voices to be heard and to do the best by them, we will necessarily need to employ an interpreter. Never use friends or family as interpreters. Not only will this increase the scope for errors, but it's likely to be that the friends or family are part of the community that the child belongs. This places the child in a very difficult position. The child may not want to speak or disclose their history in front of the friend or family for fear of community stigma and community isolation. The child may be embarrassed by what's happened to them and do not want members of the community to know. They may fear loss of ties with their own community if their history is known amongst community members. Therefore, it becomes critical that we employ only interpreters from professional agencies. The role of the interpreter is absolutely critical. Before we choose the interpreter, make sure we choose a reputable agency. Make sure we offer the child a choice as to gender. Don't automatically assume that a female child will always be more comfortable with a female interpreter. Give that choice to the child. Once an interpreter has been arranged and it's clear that the child is comfortable in the interpreter's presence and is able to speak as freely as possible, then it's a good idea to try and retain the same interpreter for all appointments. At the start of any interview, make sure the child is aware of the interpreter's role. Make sure that the interpreter is aware of their own role and emphasize that at the start of every appointment. Namely, the interpreter is there to provide an impartial, complete and confidential rendition of everything that is said. And the interpreter is not there to provide comment or their opinion or to answer on behalf of the child or to speak to the child on their own side conversations. Now, so just some key rules to keep in mind when we are using an interpreter to speak to a child. Firstly, it's really important to ask the child the question even though the interpreter is present. So always ask questions in the first person. So therefore, ask questions directly of the child. For example, can you tell me what happened today? Rather than turning to the interpreter and saying, can you ask him or her what happened? The reason for that is the scope for error is absolutely huge. It becomes very confusing when the first person is not used, and a situation can occur when it's not clear who said what and who is he and who is she. To avoid all this, and also to ensure that the child feels that it is their appointment and you're talking to them and not to the interpreter, use the first person. When acting for a child, and particularly for a trafficked child, we must always remain aware of any modulation in the interpreter's voice, as that sometimes this can be a sign of disbelieving or reproaching. Children, and more so trafficked children, are less likely to indicate that they have any difficulties or unease with the interpreter when compared with an adult. So children are less likely to say, I'm sorry, I don't know. Most children that I've represented would simply say, yes, it's okay, it's fine, it's okay. Now, in my own experience, I've had situations where I've noticed, and in one particular situation, I can give the example, where I noticed a interpreter's voice suddenly became quite harsh in a sentence. And as a response to that, the child's body closed in. So where the child's body language was quite open, it suddenly became quite closed, and there's a slight shift in the child's position from the interpreter. So it was a shift away from the interpreter. Now, I had no knowledge of the language being spoken, so I was not aware of what was being said. But I realised that those signs was something for me to be concerned. At that point, I stopped the appointment. We rearranged the appointment for the very next day with a new interpreter. And this question, the question of what was said or what happened in the appointment, was put to the child. And the child, who was a trafficked child, said the interpreter turned to him and said, "You know that doesn't happen in our community. You know you're lying." Okay, so it's just an example that where children are concerned, the child wasn't in a position to say anything back to the interpreter and wasn't in a position to speak to me. Had I not been aware of those subtle signs, body language, then it's likely that that appointment and the child's disclosure would never have been as full as I needed, and as the knowledge that the child had would never have been disclosed to me. Now remember, children will have limited vocabulary when compared to an adult. What that means is that we'll need to adapt our language depending on the child's capacity, range of vocabulary. Now, it's very easy to forget that, and the most skilled of lawyers can fall into the habit of simply speaking to a child as an adult. There's a very famous case, a very famous criminal case, and where a very respected QC, therefore being quite a senior lawyer, was criticised by one of our higher courts in the UK in the way that he was asking questions, cross-examining a 4-year-old child, in that he was asking 2 or 3 questions in one sentence. So it really doesn't matter how experienced we are, how long we've been doing this job for. We all need reminding at times that when we speak to a child, we have to adapt our language according to the child's capabilities and understanding. There is a simple framework which can assist us in doing so, and that is being produced by Police Training on Child Rights and Child Protection Manual for the Consortium for Street Children. What that manual says is simply, it gives a list of things to avoid when speaking to children, such as, and these are fairly common sense, but of course, when we're in that situation, there are things that perhaps we forget. So it's such things as, do not use long sentences. Do not use complicated sentences. Instead, use short sentences. Use simple sentences. Don't use the passive voice, for example. Was he hit by the man? Instead, use the active voice. Did the man hit him? Okay. Don't use negative sentences. For example, didn't you tell him? Rather, use positive sentences. Did you tell him? Do not ask questions with more than one meaning. Only ask questions with one meaning. Do not ask hypothetical questions. So for example, don't say, if you are tired, tell me. Instead, use the direct approach. So ask instead, are you tired? Now what I want to move on to is starting the interview. So what I've just spoken about beforehand, it's all these pre-consideration interviews, so that's even before we walk into the room and before we even start the interview with the child. It's all the things that we need to think about. Now we're moving on to starting the interview. So we have a situation now where we're in the room with the child. So the first thing is simply put the child at ease. One of the easiest and most natural ways to do that is just to smile. Okay? Just smiling just for the child to see someone who's friendly, rather than someone who may appear to the child to be quite stern. Again, may seem to be an adult in a position of authority. Maintain good eye contact, because this doesn't mean simply stare at the child non-stop, but it means employ steady visual gaze. Okay. Now, the first meeting is really important, and I believe that the first meeting is what sets the tone for all subsequent appointments. So this first appointment really is about trying to make sure the child feels comfortable in your presence, okay, and how we go about doing that. Now, make sure your body language is open. So rather than sitting like this, just be more relaxed. Again, as we'd said previously, be aware of what you're wearing and how that may be read by the child. Explain to the child who everyone in the room is. So again, as I said previously, there may be a number of bodies in the room. There'll be yourself, there'll be the child, there may be a responsible adult, and there may be an interpreter. So that's 5 bodies in the room already. That can be quite intimidating for anyone. So make sure that the child understands who everyone is, what their role is, what their remit is. But also throughout that, emphasize to the child that they are the most important person there. The reason you're there is because you want to speak to them. It's not because you want to speak to the responsible adult or to the interpreter, but you want to speak to the child. So instill a sense of ownership. Explain to the child that you are, for example, their solicitor or their legal representative, that you're there for them only. Now, explain to the child that you are working for them and only for them. The Refugee Council, the UK Refugee Council, did a focus group, and what they said their focus group revealed was that most children who were represented by legal aid solicitors believed all legal aid solicitors worked for the Home Office. Now that's astounding, but it also means that there's something along the way where we haven't, as legal aid solicitors, explained our roles clearly to the child. So make sure that the child knows who you are, why you're there, why you want to speak to them, why you want to hear from them and them only. Now, provide the child with your own contact details. So again, rather than just providing your business card to the appropriate adult or the social worker, provide it to the child also. Now, the child may have, for example, a smartphone or on email. So encourage the child to communicate with you directly. It may be by means of email, by means of WhatsApp, by means of text. I don't mean give your personal phone to the child at all. I'm talking about a situation where you may have a work mobile which will allow you to do this. Encourage the child to ask questions. So you always want the child to be engaged. One of the best ways to be engaged is to tell the child constantly, ask questions. Do you understand? Okay, make sure that the environment that you create on that first meeting is an open, friendly, relaxed environment for the child. Make sure that the child knows that they can speak to you at any time in confidence, and you will not tell anyone what they say unless they want you to. Your interviewing techniques will need to be adapted according to the understanding of the child. Now, research shows that skilled listeners ask twice as many questions and remain patient at all times. Plan the time for your appointment. Now, lengthy appointments really are not that productive. I would suggest that a child's appointment should not really exceed more than 2 hours at a time, with a break being enforced every 45 minutes. So again, don't ask the hypothetical question of do you want a break? Simply enforce the break after 45 minutes. Research also shows that children are not able to concentrate beyond 45 minutes. So every 45 minutes have a 10-minute break and then another 45 minutes. So no more than 2 hours in total. You will find that some children are afraid of the dark. So just be aware of what time your appointments are scheduled for. I've had appointments where children have sat there just simply looking out the window as the night's drawing in. And this is because of their fear of the dark, and that their need to return home before it gets too dark for them, even though they may be accompanied. So just be aware of when the appointment is going to happen, and especially in the winter, how late it may appear by the time you've concluded your appointment. Also be aware if the child is either at school or in college, they may not necessarily be in the right state of mind or that energetic to have an appointment in which they've got to talk about quite difficult things with you after a long day at school or college. I believe it's absolutely important to manage expectations. Define your boundaries and make sure that the child understands what you are able to do. Do not promise something which you cannot guarantee and which you cannot deliver. So be honest with the child. It may sometimes seem easier simply to tell a child not to worry, it'll be fine. But actually that may not be true. It may be that the child's case is refused. It may be that the child is simply not believed. Okay. Now, that can create problems in your relationship with the child and the relationship of trust if you started by saying, don't worry, it will be fine. So make it absolutely clear what you are able to do. Being emotional with a child is unlikely to build strong relationships. And that's true not just of you, but also of the interpreter. So in this role particularly, we hear histories, we hear traumatic histories, we hear histories which the contents of which we have never been exposed to. It may be upsetting, but to become upset in front of the child, I don't believe can serve any real purpose at all. I've had an appointment where my interpreter became extremely upset when listening to the child. Physically upset, you could see she was crying. We had to stop the appointment and I had to ask the interpreter to take a moment by herself outside to gather her thoughts. I also had to ask the interpreter whether she was okay to proceed. What that did was it disrupted the flow of the appointment. It also confused the child. So we had to explain why the interpreter became upset. Not that the interpreter was making any kind of judgment on what the child had said. It causes disruption for that appointment. It also, I worry that perhaps if I use the same interpreter again, the child may be that little bit more wary of what they say, because they do not want to upset the adult, and in this case, the interpreter. So being emotional to that degree, I don't believe is productive at all. It may be at times, owing to conflict in certain countries, that we see a number of children of the same nationality in a short period of time. So it may be suddenly we have many Albanian children, Syrian children, Vietnamese children. And it may be that during that course of that time, we become familiar with the main claims, with history which seems similar. However, what we must be aware of, even though that this may happen, we must not make assumptions. If you make assumptions, you will not be acting in the best interest of your client. So, let's take the example of an Albanian child. If you know that the next child you're going to see is an Albanian child you've not met before, if your assumption is, this is likely to be of blood feud because the last 5 Albanian children I've heard have spoken about blood feuds which may have led then on to trafficking. If your assumption is that before you even meet the child, you're doing half your job. The reason for that is because it's likely once you start making assumptions, you are not going to give the time and explore the child's claim to the degree you would have done had you not made those assumptions. Be very aware of your own stereotypes and of your own assumptions. Don't allow your judgments and your assumptions lead to a failure to recognize indicators of trafficking. We've already spoke about that a child may have limited vocabulary. With the use of an interpreter, the disclosure may become even more restricted. Therefore, it means that we have to explore the language that a child may use and really understand how that language and how the words being used by a child are being used. So what they mean to the child. So sufficiently probe into the child's use of words. Now, as children, because of their limited vocabulary, may struggle to locate the correct words to describe their experiences. So without you probing and without you exploring, there remains the possibility that the child's accurate account may not be elicited. Now, this is best illustrated by, again, one of my own examples where I was representing a young child in which she said, "Uncle A raped me." I really wanted to understand what she meant by being raped. So instead of just simply taking those instructions, I then continued to explore what rape meant to her in that context and asked her to explain what happened with Uncle A. It transpired actually that Uncle A had touched this young girl's arm, and this had caused a physical reaction within her. She felt uncomfortable by his touch. She felt scared by his touch. She was worried what may happen. But what it was not rape as we understand it. It was not rape at all in the legal sense. So you can see, had I simply continued without exploring the word rape, what the word rape meant for this child, that could have led to a very confusing state of affairs when she would be further questioned about this incident by perhaps other professionals and state authorities. Therefore, it becomes critical that we explore the words used by children, which may be words that we're familiar with and that we understand in a legal context. However, that may not be the meaning ascribed to those words by the child itself. Now, just be culturally aware that the children that we represent may come from a range of different cultures. And in those cultures, there may be norms which are different from the culture that we live in. So, for example, in some cultures, a child's status in home and wider society varies a lot. Now, these cultural differences can be misinterpreted, so it remains important that we're aware of what the most common cultural differences are. Now, some of the common ones are lack of eye contact. In some cultures, it's considered that if a child looks at an adult in the eye to be a sign of disrespect. However, of course, in our westernized culture, we may misinterpret that, or we interpret that as being perhaps a sign of a child not being truthful. In some cultures, it's considered disrespectful to refer to an adult by their full name, and children will simply call most adults either uncle or aunt. This may be problematic for proving their claim. However, one needs to be culturally aware and be aware that in that child's culture, they may never know what an adult's full name is. Now, of course, you are a lawyer and you're representing the child as a lawyer. It may be that the child feels that they had to give a right answer and they're scared of what they're going to say. So there's a constant conflict of what shall I say? How shall I say it? Well, what am I going to say the right thing? It's really important you explain to the client, you emphasize to the child that there is no right or wrong answer. It's simply what the child knows. And I think that's really important. Once we can dislodge that theme of that there must be a right answer, that can really aid disclosure. So it's simply what you know. Everything you say is important. Everything you say is perfectly fine. And of course, hand in hand goes that there's going to be something that the child simply does not know or simply does not want to talk about. Emphasize again that it's perfectly acceptable to say, I do not know, rather than think I must give an answer. If a child doesn't know, then say that. If the child doesn't want to talk about it at that point in time, that's perfectly acceptable. So don't push the child to disclose when they're not ready to do so. Instead, make a note that the child does have some knowledge, but right now is not a good time for them to disclose. So be aware of the child's limitation. Be aware of their emotional limitation. Be aware of their physical limitation. Do as much as you're able to in any one appointment, but don't impose rigid deadlines. So it may be you start an appointment with the hope and the intention of doing X amount. However, you can see also the child is getting very tired. The child is becoming extremely emotional. So just be aware of those things. And it may be that, yes, you haven't done even a quarter of what you'd hoped to do. At that point, you need to end the appointment and start again on another day. Be also aware, disclosure can take a long time. Of course, factors such as you building a relationship of trust with the child, you using language with the child, understands the child being in a position where they feel safe to disclose to you will have an impact, of course. But even despite that, one of my own cases in which I've been representing a young person for over 6 years now, so this is the 7th year I've been representing this child continuously. And even though I believed we'd built a good relationship of trust, and I'd hoped he was already in a position where he felt able to disclose to me. Up until a few months ago, even more information came out. So late disclosure can happen, in this case happened after 6 years. Disclosure, of course, isn't just one solitary event. Disclosure will come, in my experience, in part, at times, when the child's ready. But always be open to the possibility that the child may disclose something new, no matter how long you've been working with the child, no matter if you think everything that can be said has been said already by the child. In my experience, children will usually follow the line of least resistance. So they want to, in my experience, children want to avoid getting into trouble and they want to do the right thing by the adult. So by the adult who's questioning them, by you, by the lawyer. And it's clear that sometimes children will simply respond in a manner which they hope will please the adult. Therefore, what this means, it's absolutely of the utmost importance to be critically aware of your own body language, of your own facial expressions, of your tone of voice, of other non-verbal indicators of displeasure, frustration, judgment or a lack of patience, because the child will see that. You may not be able to see the faces that you're pulling, you may be unconsciously pulling, but the child can see it. As someone who's trained other people entering the profession, I've sat in appointments when representatives have interviewed children, and it's absolutely fascinating the lack of self-awareness one can have of how many facial expressions you may pull and the changes in the tone of voice in any one appointment. So things like frowning or a reaction. Those reactions may be misinterpreted by the child, who can see your face, can see your reactions, and that may cause the child to misinterpret them in a way that they believe that you are frustrated, that you don't disbelieve, that you are passing judgment in some way. This may then lead the child not to be as forthcoming as you had wanted them to be. And again, what this does is cause an obstacle to disclosure. The next stage I want to move on to is actually conducting the interview. Now, remember, at the outset I said when I started doing this work and when I started working with child victim trafficking, I found it extremely difficult, and I was unable to find any kind of guide to assist me. I have, however, since those days, now come across something called cognitive interviewing, which I think is an amazing method. It is called the cognitive interview of children, and it's been developed by the Institute of Forensic Expert Opinion in Krakow. What cognitive interviewing is, it is a method to help children improve the process of recall without increasing the amount of inaccurate or invented data. So therefore, trying to get the most accurate disclosure from the child without mistakes and errors. Now, how does one do that? What cognitive interviewing tells us is, firstly, sit naturally, sit leaned towards the child, be friendly, use friendly expressions, use frequent eye contact, speak slowly, use short sentences, speak slowly and pause. Express your attention by nodding and saying "aha," but do not use evaluative terms such as "that's right." Praise the child for their efforts. Avoid rapid movements or chaotic styles of speaking. Don't interrupt the child. Let the child speak. Show patience and have breaks. The first phase is to personalize the interview. So, greet the child. Use their first name. Introduce yourself and any other third party in the interviewing room. Start a conversation on a totally unrelated matter. So, for example, if you know the child is a football fan, perhaps you talk about the last night's game. If you know the child is a music fan, perhaps you talk about a concert. So anything that's totally unrelated. Phase 2 is to explain the goals of the interview to the child. So tell the child that when they're speaking, to describe everything that comes to their mind. Don't filter. What we don't want the child doing is thinking that some things are important and some things are not. At this stage, everything is important. Explain to the child that the appointment will require concentration. So sometimes I've had appointments where the child has said, "I have such a bad headache." Immediately, I've realized that the child is not going to be able to concentrate. So we haven't really progressed that appointment at all, because I know that appointment will probably be half disclosure or have inaccuracies, and we will necessarily need to go over the same ground again in the next appointment. So I've taken a very conscious decision not to proceed with that appointment, and instead we've talked about slightly related but not continued with how I intended the appointment to be. Discourage the child from guessing. So when the child is talking to you, tell them, if they don't know, simply to say that. Don't guess. Don't try and fill in the gaps by guessing. If the child doesn't know, simply say, I don't know. Phase 3, cognitive interviewing tells us, is reinstating the context of the event. So that's basically what happened. This can be done in 2 ways. The first way is either by you asking specific questions, or it can be done by free account. If you're asking questions, ask the child to listen to the instruction carefully. Now this goes back again to making sure that the child understands you. So not just when we talked about vocabulary and understand the child's use of words, this is the child understanding your use of the words. Give the child enough time to reinstate the context. Ask questions slowly, making intentional pauses. And of course, ask one question at a time. If by free account, and I have to say that is actually my own preferred method, then simply ask the child to describe all the memories of that event. As the child is speaking, do not interrupt the child and don't ask any specific questions. Paraphrase the child's last thought without adding any detail. If the child stops at any point, demonstrate patience and stay quiet. It's important to remember that this phase precedes asking questions, and silence can be a tool of eliciting more elaborate answers. When the child makes an impression of having finished the narrative, don't start asking questions immediately, but rather encourage the child to try and recall more details by asking, do you remember anything else? And wait for a few more seconds. I tried this is what I do, and it's really quite telling how much more information comes by just asking that one question, by remaining quiet and then asking that question, do you remember anything else? Now we move on to phase 4 of cognitive interviewing. And this is the phase where we ask questions. So we've had an account by the child. It may be by specific questioning, or it may be by free recall. Now explain to the child we want to ask details of the account of the event. Again, explain to the child that you want them to describe everything that comes to their mind. So again, we don't want the child to filter. We don't want them to guess or invent anything. Responding to the questions will require attention and effort. So be aware of the child's limitations. You need the child to be able to engage with you and to retain attention. What cognitive interviewing tells us is that asking questions is associated with activating imaginative pictures or representations in the child's mind. So, when a question is asked of the child's mind will read out a picture. For example, if we request a child to describe his or her teacher, a picture of that person will emerge into the child's consciousness. And they will read out what they can see in the picture. If we then ask another question concerning the same picture, so we may ask, well, what is your teacher wearing? The same picture is retained in the child's mind, and they continue to read from the same picture. And we may carry on along that line. So we say, how tall is your teacher? Again, the child is still using the same picture. Cognitive interviewing tells us hopping from one representation, from one picture to another picture, reduces the amount of accurate information. So going back to the example of the teacher, once we've asked the questions about the teacher, how tall he or she may be, what they may be wearing, and we've then moved on to, well, can you explain who else was in the room, or can you describe and tell me who else was in the room? The picture of the teacher is replaced by a picture of the room. That simple act of moving from one picture to another picture requires effort. What we should do is continue asking questions about the room. So who else is there? Can you describe how many people are there? What do they look like? How tall are they? What are they wearing? However, if we then say, oh, by the way, I just need to ask you a few more questions about your teacher, and we return back to the teacher, that picture of the room is again put away. The same picture of the teacher is recalled as previously. It is that hopping about from one picture to another picture that cognitive interviewing tells us causes inaccuracies. What that means on a day-to-day practical front is that when we speak to children, when we interview children, insofar as possible, ensure that we exhaust all our questions about one particular aspect. So make sure we ask all the questions about the teacher that we want to before we move on to others in the room, rather than moving back again to the teacher. Cognitive interviewing also tells us, for older children, it may be useful to employ the instruction, tell me about it, as if it was a movie being played backwards from the end. And amongst younger children, to use the instruction, tell me what your teddy bear could see if it was there. So tell me what your teddy bear could see if it was there. So now we've asked those questions we wanted to, we've obtained more detail from the child, and we move on to the final phase, which is phase 5 and closure. Now, closure is as important as all of the other stages. It's not simply a wrap up at the end. For closure, cognitive interviewing tells us to try and create a positive impression of the whole process. So thank the child for their effort. Recognize that it took a lot for the child to talk to you. It took concentration. It took trust. Thank the child for their participation. And express an interest in the child's feeling and emotional state. Again, personally, I also try to end the appointment about talking about something completely different. So trying to just ground the child again before they leave the appointment, so their thoughts and head are simply not full of the trauma which they've just described to you. So again, it may be you want to talk about what they're going to do tomorrow evening, what they're doing at school, football, whatever it may be that you know the child has an interest in. Importantly, always recognise the child's effort and thank them for their participation. Explain to the child what the next steps are. So at the end of the appointment, ensure that the child understands what's going to happen next. I now want to move on to obstacles to effective interviewing. We've all been there. There's sometimes when, despite our best efforts, the child simply isn't disclosing or isn't disclosing as much as we want them to. So we know a lot more's happened. The child's given hints of that, there's indications of that, but they simply are not able to tell you. I want to just explore at this point what kind of obstacles there may be. Chief amongst them is repetition. I remember speaking to a criminal solicitor who represents child victims of trafficking in their criminal cases, who said by the time the child sees her, they've already been subjected to approximately 12 interviews. So repetition is a real obstacle. Children will become frustrated. It may be that they've told so many people before and they simply don't understand why they've got to tell you yet again the same information which they've told many times. So patience is required. We spoke about this before, tiredness, especially after a day at school. So again, just be aware of the time of your appointment. Probably not too early, because again, in my experience, children struggle to come to really early appointments. About 11:30 tends to be a good time to start, in my experience, an appointment with children. Make sure that your appointment is held in a safe place. A safe place where the child feels comfortable and able to be able to disclose. One of my own experiences, I was representing a young girl who was accompanied by a responsible adult. It was the first appointment, and despite my best efforts, it really wasn't as flowing as I'd hoped. What I did notice is that the child kept looking down at the floor. She had a cap on and she kept pulling the cap over her eyes, so she kept doing this, kept kind of almost trying to hide her own face. So it wasn't a long appointment. As I said, it was the first appointment, but still I didn't feel that I'd established even a little bit of a relationship. Following the conclusion of the appointment, the responsible adult called me a few hours later, telling me that the first place that the child had been trafficked to was actually a building round the corner from my office. And being in my office absolutely petrified her. She felt uncomfortable and scared of being there. She was worried she may be recognised by the traffickers and just wanted to leave my office as quick and as soon as possible. From there on, all the appointments were held in a safe third place, in this instance, in the offices of the Refugee Council. Now, I received funding to do that, so it wasn't an issue, but it also meant, more importantly, that the child now was in a space where they felt much safer than they did in my office. So again, just something to be aware of and to explore when a child may not be engaging. Some of the children that we represent will have endured horrific travel journeys. And things may have happened in those travel journeys which play constantly on the mind of the child. So much so that they are not able to move away from the impact of the journey. I represented a young boy who had come from a very wealthy background in his own home country, a very, very good standard of living, and a very wealthy family, very well-to-do family. They had to flee. In the family was himself, his mother, his father, and his younger brother. When war broke out, his mother arranged his journey and placed in his care his younger brother. Now, my client was no more than 16 when he fled. His younger brother was about 5 or 6. My client described a journey to me of being in a boat with others and his younger brother. He describes a journey of being in the open sea. So we can imagine this is a boat with smugglers. It's a very full boat. It's a low boat. My client is one side, his younger brother is on the other side of the boat. All of a sudden, the smugglers become aware that there may be border force patrolling and tell everyone to stay still. All the lights go off, and the boat in which my client is speeds up. Unknown to my client, his younger brother is placed on the edge of the boat. As the boat speeds up, the child falls into the sea. My client runs the length of the boat, or scrambles, probably more accurately, scrambles the length of the boat to try and rescue his brother. As he's doing so, he's stabbed on the foot by the smuggler, who said, "We've told you to stay quiet and stay down." His brother is lost at sea, and that's the last time he sees his younger brother. My client is consumed by guilt that his mother placed his younger brother in his care, and he failed her, and he lost his brother. My client cannot move past this point, and it's all that he wants to talk about. He's so consumed by grief. Of course, we make the necessary counselling referrals, but be aware that what may be important to you to elicit from the client may not necessarily be what the client wants to talk about, and what is deemed important may not be what the client at that point in time considers important to them. Another obstacle, and quite a common obstacle for trafficked children, is fear. Now, that represents itself in various guises. So it could be fear of adults. So again, just going back to what I said previously, children tend to be trafficked by adults and people in authority. So there may be fear of adults, there may be fear of adults in authority, which hinders disclosure. There may be a fear of the interpreter and the interpreter's community ties. There may be fear of having done wrong and self-doubt and self-blame. So I've had situations where a child has been sold into trafficking by their parents, by their mother. And the child has continuously asked me, "Why did mom do this? What did I do for mom to do this?" There may be fear of the system, simply not knowing what happens in the system, or simply having heard from friends, having heard from others in similar situation, that the claims will be refused. There may be fear of having to speak about what's happened to them. There may be shame in having to speak about their histories. There may be fear of reprisals. Now, this particularly for children and adults, but particularly for children, is such a controlling mechanism. And in some cases, there may be juju. Now, what is juju? Juju is a supernatural power attributed to a charm or fetish, particularly of a type used by some West African people. The impact of juju really cannot be underestimated. It is such a strong controlling mechanism that it simply can silence a person. Again, my own experience, I can illustrate this best by an example from my own experiences where I was representing a young girl. And while she was happy to talk to me generally, would not disclose what had happened to her. And the only thing she kept saying was, "If I tell you, Kalvin, I will not wake up in the morning." So her fear was so immense, she believed it will be followed by her death. It took myself and her refugee council worker a lot of time to reassure her, a lot of time to break down that fear, until she came to a point where she felt she was able to tell us what happened. However, when she spoke at 100 miles an hour, because she wanted to tell us as soon as she could. She wanted it over and done with as quickly as possible. What it also meant is I could not make notes, I could not type because of the speed of delivery. So in that instance, I simply got a tape recorder and taped her, which meant I was not sitting at a computer typing and perhaps not looking at her. I didn't have my head down and perhaps be misinterpreted as not listening to the client because I'm not looking at her. It meant that we was in a space where she could speak. I did not interrupt her, and I had it on tape. But it took a long time to get there. So juju is a real concern, and it is a really effective controlling mechanism. In addition to fear, anger can also be an obstruction to effective interviewing and disclosure. Now, the child may have anger, for example, at the local authority for not accepting their age. And this happens frequently in cases where children have been trafficked, that the local authority may believe that they are much older than they state, that they're much older than their given date of birth. Now, for trafficked children, age and their age being accepted is really quite important because it's integral to their identity. And it may be the only part that they have control over. So, they may have been exploited by an adult in various ways. And the only thing that they hold on to is age. So when that is then disputed by local authority or the Home Office, this can cause significant anger for the child. There may be anger at the immigration authorities for not believing the account, for not believing the history. So the child it may have been really quite traumatic for the child to disclose what has happened to them, to not just yourselves, but also to the immigration officer. And the decision is made that they are not credible. That can also cause anger. And again, as previously said, there may be anger at parents or primary caregivers who may have sold the child, and the child simply cannot get an answer to the question of why. Why did this happen? Why did they do this? So we have fear and we have anger as obstacles. We also, of course, have trauma. I would say all the children I've represented who have been trafficked have also been traumatised. Now, UNHCR found that adolescents are usually the most neglected of all the age groups because of the mature adult-like behaviour they adopt under stress. So that's simply, as an adolescent, it's a difficult age, not quite an adult. And yet the child may believe that they've got to act as though they are an adult. So they may present as being quite okay, quite able to deal with everything that's happened. And again, we'll hear frequently, I'm okay, I'm fine. Now, UNHCR say this is really quite common of adolescents. And they found that manifestations of trauma included shutting down, weeping, uncontrollable weeping, self-blame, and disengagement. So we have three main obstacles: fear, anger, and trauma. I would say all three will be present in most, if not all, of the cases in which we represent. So how do we overcome this? We need to get those instructions, but we're also very wary that these massive obstacles are in the child's way. Now what follows next really is just my own suggestions. The first suggestion really is, if the child can write, ask them to write out what happened. So write their own statement in their own time. That is then to be translated, is to be used as a foundation for instructions. Is not the whole complete instructions, but it's a foundation, it's a basis upon which we can work. Is there to be used for clarification and expansion by your interviewing. It may be that you need to rely more heavily on third-party sources. For example, social workers' assessments, how and why the child came into care, whether there's any child protection assessments. You may have to look towards medical evidence. You may need educational psychologist assessments. It may be the child has a good relationship with the foster parent, and the foster parent may be able to provide a statement. It may be that you yourself will have to prepare a statement detailing the difficulties you've had taking instructions. And of course, you may have to rely on objective country evidence. And some children may be more comfortable by conveying their experiences by drawing. So if that's the case, encourage them. I represented a very young child of 9 who was a fantastic artist, and he just simply drew away, and we presented his drawings as his statement. So those are just some suggestions. Of course, you will find your own preferred methods, but those are simply just some suggestions of how we may be able to come obstacles when we're interviewing. One of the issues that may arise when taking instructions from a child, or when a child's claim is being assessed, is the issue of credibility. Now that really refers to internal inconsistencies. So that being what the child says changes within their account. Or external inconsistencies. That may be what the child says simply is not supported by the objective evidence. When we're assessing credibility for children, we do need to take into account the following factors. Take into account the age and the maturity of the child. Take into account any reports that you may have commissioned. And always remember, for children, there's a liberal application of the benefit of doubt. It may be the more weight is to be given to objective indicators of risk rather than the child's state of mind. For reports, again, we've touched on a few of them. The child psychologist reports, there may be physical health, there may be reports from welfare and health support professionals whom the child may have disclosed different aspects of their case and the different aspects of their history. This is all relevant evidence. Now, liberal application, always remember that the benefit of doubt will need to be applied more generously when dealing with a child. Now, be proactive in obtaining all relevant information and evidence, including country evidence, to overcome any issues of credibility. When assessing credibility in a child's case, remember the child's age and maturity. Remember the mental or emotional trauma that they may be subjected to. Think of their education level, their level of comprehension, their capacity. Remember that the child may still mistrust you and mistrust the authorities. Explore whether there remains any feelings of shame or any stigma which is hindering instructions. Remember, by talking about the histories, is bringing to the fore painful memories that the child may not want to think about. So take these things all into account when assessing credibility. What should we do when there are credibility concerns. Again, the following are simple suggestions and things that I've tried to employ in my own practice. The first is confronting. So when I say confronting, I'm not saying it to imply aggression or hostility or disbelief. It simply means ensuring that the child understands why vagueness in account or lack of detail in the account may prove to be problematic in the future and how it may be viewed by the decision maker. Once children understand the reason why they're being asked quite personal questions and quite forensic questions, children tend to be more forthcoming. So firstly, confronting, which simply means putting the vagueness, the discrepancies, the inconsistencies, the seemingly inconsistencies and contradictions in the account to the child without value judgment to resolve. Timelines. So sometimes credibility issues can arise owing to timelines. The concept of time may not have the same emphasis for a child as it does to an adult. It's really important to be aware that children have a very different perspective of time to that of an adult. So 6 months may seem like over a year ago. Questions about dates or a sequence of events are unlikely to the same results if asked more than once. It's also, I think, important to remember that in some cultures, time doesn't have the same importance and emphasis as it may do in the Western world. If a child can't say how long an event took or how long ago a particular event happened, try to find a point of reference which is common to the child or which is more familiar to the child, such as birthdays, if a birthday is celebrated, a religious festival, a school term. So you may want to ask, well, when did this happen near about your birthday? Did it happen during a religious festival? Did it happen at the beginning of school? Did it happen at the end of school? So this at least will provide a time frame, but a time frame in which the child can work and relate to. It must be remembered that trafficked children sometimes will only be moved from one premises to another premises at night by their traffickers. This is done deliberately to cause a sense of disorientation. So when you ask a child how long a particular journey may have taken, it may be that they have no idea whatsoever because of being disorientated. All in all, what this comes down to is when we assess the evidence of children, and particularly trafficked children, if we're judging it by the standards applied to adults, the evidence of children is likely to contain gaps. It's likely to contain inconsistencies and implausibility. And there are likely to be parts of our evidence that are not objectively true and which are recounted with no intention to deceive. There is a difference between adults and children. For all these reasons, the benefit of doubt should be applied liberally in cases of children. For all these reasons, there should be a greater emphasis on examination of country information and objective factors than on the subjective evidence of a child. What we've seen so far is what we think about before we interview a child. Kind of things that we need to bear in mind, such as the placing of the furniture, where the interpreter sits, who the interpreter is, how we interview a child, the 5 phases of cognitive interviewing, including the very important phase of closure, how we address gaps and inconsistencies, how we remain aware of obstacles to effective interviewing and disclosure, and how we may be able to assess credibility issues. Now, all that is really so we're able to represent the child as effectively as possible and give the child and let the voice of the child be heard. Absolutely central to this is a recognition to be effective, you need to look after yourself. This area of work is likely to expose us to traumatic histories. We listen to the child, we listen to their history, we listen to their exploitation, we listen to their fears, we listen to their trauma, receive that traumatic information. We help manage that information. We employ active listening. We ask follow-up questions. We're not simply just sitting there. We're understanding. We display empathy. We manage the information for a specific purpose, to seek protection. However, in doing so, we are sharing in the child's experience. So what does that do to us? What happens to us when we listen to those traumatic histories? How do we respond to the child when they convey their history to us? And how does our response impact on us? So is it a natural response? We display empathy, we become tearful, we seek physical contact to reassure the child. So we want to touch them, we want to place our hand on their shoulder, on their arm. Is it a learned response? We know the right words because we've been told that these are the right words. And we know to show just the right amount of empathy. But at all times we remain professional. Is it a bewildered response? We simply don't know what to do. We continue after a while. We apologise that we've upset the child. And do we go away thinking about how we respond? Do we reflect on our own reactions? Do we feel guilty about asking the questions which upset the child? Do we start thinking why the child acted in such a way? Do we start to dwell on it? I know as a practitioner, I've gone through all of those ranges at some point in my career. There isn't much information in the UK about the impact of trauma in protection or asylum lawyers. There are, however, some research which has been done in the States. Asylum lawyers are at quite high risk of developing secondary trauma, and the research suggests that the development of secondary trauma in asylum lawyers may be related to, firstly, the amount of exposure to traumatic material, the hours we spend, and the over-investing in a client. The lack of professional training experience. So within my whole of my professional training, my academic, my vocational and my professional, no one's really taught me how to deal with secondary trauma at all. And the history of personal trauma. So the potential history of personal trauma in the lawyer may trigger a response, a recognition, an affinity of some sort. So how does this secondary trauma then exhibit itself? Firstly, in burnout. What is burnout? Burnout is a state of physical, emotional and mental exhaustion caused by long-term involvement in emotionally demanding situations. I'm pretty sure all of us at some time has felt that way. I know I felt it. I remember at times, and the only way I can best describe it is where I just simply felt my body was being held up by sellotape. I felt as though I was going to crumble at any moment. So we have burnout. And we have vicarious traumatization, which is an accumulation of memories of client's traumatic material that affects your perspective of the world. This is the state when we've been exposed to so much traumatic histories that our mind makes us question our worldview. We start thinking that all the world is evil. How could things like this happen? And I know for myself, when I started doing this work, I saw child trafficking everywhere. In every situation, I saw through a child trafficking lens. Within vicarious traumatization, there's also secondary traumatic stress, which is when we start exhibiting the same symptoms described by our client. So if our client says, I'm completely fatigued, I have headaches constantly, all of a sudden we find ourselves mimicking those symptoms. That's vicarious traumatization. Now, what does this do to us? How does it impact on us? It can cause a shift in the meaning of key concepts. So, for example, concepts such as justice, such as humanity, such as the rule of law. What is justice? We may have entered this profession, I'm hoping at some point, with the belief that we believe in justice. We are here to do good. We're here to uphold the rule of law. And suddenly we're exposed to so many traumatic histories, and we have to listen to how one human being causes so much pain and suffering to another, that we start questioning what the rule of law is, and then we start questioning its purpose. We start questioning its failure to protect. There may be a shift in our concept of humanity. So how does humanity allow such things to happen? How can it be that one individual can be so cruel to another? We start questioning what is pain, because the accounts we listen to contain such extremities of pain. We listen to accounts of torture that we didn't even know existed. So suddenly we question what pain is. We relive in the trauma. We have to read through the client's papers again and again because of appointments. We need to do statements. We need to liaise with state authorities. We have to conduct appeals. So we're constantly being exposed to the trauma. This can manifest itself. The physical manifestations may include headaches, aches and pains in the body, a loss of appetite, insomnia, a lack of enthusiasm. We may suddenly find ourselves getting angry at the slightest thing, but we're not quite sure why. We're not able to explain our own reactions. We suddenly have a very short fuse, when actually we don't generally. And our interpersonal relationships may start suffering. So we don't want to socialise with people at work. And likewise, we don't particularly want to socialise with our partner or do anything when we get home. So suddenly all that's happening is we work, from work we go home, from home we go to work. When we find ourselves in that position, in that situation, what is the impact on the client? Does our care and our work become compromised as a result? What can happen is we can become over-involved. So we start spending too much time on one client, much more than we should, and we neglect. We just do about as much as we need to on other cases, but in this one particular case, because we're so worried, we start over-investing. We have lengthy appointments, but there's not really need for such a long appointment. We're constantly worrying about them. We call them far too frequently. So now we can see, upon reflection, that our professional boundaries are becoming a little bit blurred. Or do we start avoiding? That we simply don't want to deal with our client because it's too difficult. You know that you need to progress the matter, but in your mind, it can wait till tomorrow because there's always something else to do. So suddenly we find ourselves just avoiding that particular case which causing us trauma. Or do we try to delegate to another staff member Do we try and delegate it to our supervisor or to one of our other team members so we don't have to deal with it? Do we start becoming really cynical and therefore avoid exploration? We start switching off when the client speaks. We don't follow up at the points that we should have done, and therefore we're compromising the client's representation. What should we do professionally? So we find ourselves in such a situation. What do we do? Where can we turn to? Now, all the studies make reference to three main points. The first is healthy coping strategies. This actually requires an awareness in yourself. It's really reliant on you understanding you need help. You need to do something. So what can be healthy coping strategies? Just take time out. It could be you need a break. Know your own boundaries. Don't take work home. Keep that work-home division quite clear. Have a diversity of casework. So your casework simply isn't cases of trafficked children with traumatic histories. Find something to do or to watch every day which makes you laugh. Secondly, is to incorporate self-care into vocational courses. The legal profession is very bad in doing that, but it's my belief that respected professions need to endorse the message that it's perfectly fine to speak out and not to be afraid when you are finding a little bit overwhelming because of the traumatic histories you've been exposed to. To send a message and create an environment that to speak out isn't to be equated with lack of competence. To create an environment where to speak out does not have any kind of negative impact on your promotion prospects. And to create a profession where there is a supportive environment to allow us to seek supervision and guidance when we find ourselves in such a situation. And the third point that the studies make reference to is support networks, is to create or to make sure you have support networks around you. And now that may be simply within a work environment, is simply at the end of the day or end of the week, sitting with colleagues and talking about cases. Myself, again, I did this frequently in one of the organisations that I worked at. At the end of the day at 5:30, we'd all get together in a common space, so not in the office, in a common space, and just discuss our cases. It was a way which we could talk to each other without formality, but also where we could make sure our colleagues knew of any difficult cases, of any concerns that we may have had, of any cases which we found it difficult to deal with, which in itself meant my colleagues would be aware when I saw that particular client, they would come to me after the appointment and ask if I needed help, if I needed support. So that's a really simple way of just creating a positive support network within the organisations you work. So that's professionally. What can we do personally? Recognise your own reactions and be articulate. Learn how to manage your reactions and speak to your supervisor or your senior about your feelings. Maintain a balance between home and work. Lawyers in the legal aid sector are particularly bad at this, but not to have that balance will ultimately mean you will suffer from burnout. Your boundaries will become blurred. You will not be as effective for your client as you know you can be. Connect with others, seek support, seek their counsel. This profession is one of the most supportive professions I know. Everyone is willing to help. Everyone is willing to give time. So make those connections and speak to others. Speak to others who have been in the situation you may now find yourself. And seek positive experiences outside of work. Find something that rejuvenates you and keeps you healthy. Do something which is not remotely connected with work. On a personal front, I will not do anything in my own time to do with child trafficking. So I will avoid all films to do with child trafficking. I will not attend those exhibitions at all. And that is my own barriers. Find your own barriers and remain healthy in order to do the best you can by your child clients. Thank you for listening. I hope some of those things are things upon which you can build upon. And I do hope you find them useful.